I thought by way of introduction to this next panel, I'd briefly share my favorite passages from each of these authors' books. In her bestseller, Grace and Power, Sally Bedell Smith writes, quote, "The Kennedys cast aside the bland exertions of the 1950s and set America on a higher path that combined the sophistication of the old world and the vitality and power of the new. In the process, they left behind a more assertive nation, infused with a vision and an aesthetic that found its inspiration in Jeffersonian ideals." Richard Reeves' biography, President Kennedy, Profile and Power, was the first book I read when offered a job here. He writes, quote, "The nation was reflecting its leader who was focusing Americans on the things that mattered, active citizenship, the joy of life itself. Quote, I have called for a higher degree of physical fitness in our nation, JFK proclaimed. It is only natural that I should call for the kind of intellectual and spiritual fitness which underlies the flowering of the arts. He seemed," Reeves concludes, "to be bringing out the best in people." In her compilation of the condolence mail written to Jacqueline Kennedy, Ellen Fitzpatrick marries her own personal experience, scholarly background, with letters that she describes as, quote, "an American elegy as poignant and compelling as the letter writer's shattered and cherished dreams." How powerful was the past forum we had when Ellen discussed the process of writing that book in the company of many of the letter writers themselves and their heirs, all of us connected through the condolence mail housed in our archives. In his book, Ask Not, The Inauguration of John F. Kennedy and the Speech That Changed America, Thurston Clarke writes, "Kennedy's inaugural address was his philosophical autobiography, informed by his knowledge of the worst modern warfare can do, his fear of nuclear war, his understanding of the dynamics of third world nationalism, and his encounters with abject poverty. Ask Not was not only the master sentence of Kennedy's inaugural, but the master sentence of his life, what his books and speeches had been leading toward for a quarter of a century." Our moderator, Ted Widmer, has written a number of essays and book reviews about JFK, calling him, quote, "one of the most elusive quarries a biographer can chase." He quotes Kennedy himself, who wrote in Profiles in Courage, "No matter how many details a scholar can ferret out, quote, each man remains something of an enigma, shadowed by a veil which cannot be torn away." We're not here today to unveil any shadows, but to reflect on the life and accomplishments of a man based on the experience and scholarship of some of the finest historians and biographers who have written about him. Please join me in welcoming Sally Bedell Smith, Thurston Clarke, Ellen Fitzpatrick, Richard Reeves, and Ted Widmer.
Thank you all. Thank you, Tom. Tom Oliphant ended the last panel with the comment that historians can seem omniscient, and I'd like to quickly disabuse him and all of you of that notion, first by saying how much we envy the panelists of the first panel with the experiences they lived through in the Kennedy administration, and secondly by saying we can be as surprised by the revelation of new information as anyone else, and today we've got some. Today's New Yorker has a lovely piece by an Obama speechwriter, Adam Frankel, who worked closely with Ted Sorensen. And in the excitement over the 50th anniversary that we are now celebrating, a month ago, or a few weeks ago, there was a ceremony in Washington to celebrate the 50th anniversary of the great Inauguration address. And Adam Frankel read an article in the Washington Post the next day about the reunion of some Kennedy administration secretaries who'd gotten together amidst all the hubbub, and he arranged to see Ted Sorensen's secretary, and she brought a hitherto unknown first manuscript copy of the inaugural address. So we've got a very important new window into the history of the writing of that speech. And 50 years later, that speech is still very much with us. We can quote sections of it from memory with ease, and I'd like to turn to Thurston Clarke to my right and ask, why is it that that speech is still so alive?
Well, a whole bunch of things came together. You have a great occasion, you had an audience that wanted to hear what he was saying, you have great words, and you have a great orator. The great occasion almost speaks for itself. This beautiful, sunny, cold, snowy day. Kennedy talks about the torch being passed to a new generation. Well, there's Eisenhower shrunk into his overcoat, his head like a little tortoise. There's Kennedy. No hat, no coat. No, he had long underwear, but nobody knows that at the time. Then we come to the words. Now, this speech wasn't an accident. Kennedy started out intending to write one of the great inaugural addresses. During the campaign, he sometimes would stop when he saw a historical marker, and he'd go and take some notes. One of his aides said, well, what are you doing, Jack? Why are we stopping? He said, there may be something there I can use in my inaugural address. This is before he'd been elected. Then he gives Ted Sorensen the job of writing the speech, and he doesn't just say, here's what I'd like to do. He says, go and study the Gettysburg Address, learn what its secrets are. In other words, I'm going to deliver a speech as good as the Gettysburg Address. Then it comes time, he's planning the inauguration, and Robert Frost is going to read a poem. Kennedy says, I'll only agree to it if he doesn't write an original poem, because I'm afraid he's going to steal the limelight. He said the headline the next day will be, Frost delivers, poem. And so he not only did that, but the poem that Frost was going to deliver, Kennedy made him change a couple of words. Now, it takes a lot of chutzpah to tell Robert Frost that he can't read a poem, so the gift outright was the poem. Then, going along, there's this wonderful moment the night before the inauguration when Kennedy has just been at a symphony, then one of the pieces has celebrated Thomas Jefferson, and he has taken from the program, there's some of Jefferson's words. Kennedy flicks on the light in the car, he looks down, he reads Jefferson's words, and he suddenly looks very sad, and he shakes his head, and he turns to Bill Walton, and he says, better than mine. So he's already, looking. Then when he delivers the speech, he makes over 30 extemporaneous changes to the text as he delivers them, and one of them is the famous ask not line. So it originally read, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you will do for your country. And be careful of the internet, because that original version is on some of the internet sites, so you can actually get that famous line wrong. Finally, you have an audience that was aching to hear what Kennedy said. Remember, this is a few years after Sputnik. Americans were worried. We also had this feeling that we'd lost our way. There was no national purpose. There were all of these groups and getting together. There was a presidential commission on the national purpose. And finally, the Look magazine did a poll just before he delivered the speech. They asked college students what they could have. They listed a whole bunch of goodies. 2% of the students said they wanted a new car. 62% said they wanted to get a PhD. So this was the kind of audience that Kennedy was speaking to.
As a former speechwriter for a president, I can tell you that we always were trying to achieve the Gettysburg Address. And the miracle, if that anyone came as close as President Kennedy and Ted Sorensen did, it was to a certain extent a triumph of language, and specifically the use of short sentences and short words, but it was also a triumph of the performance of the speech, the rich voice, the drama, the wisps of smoke coming out of his mouth in the cold air.
When let the word go forth, and suddenly this cloud came, as if the word was coming
exactly,
forth.
Exactly. But the speech had tremendously important policy ramifications from the first minutes of the Kennedy administration. And if I can turn to Dick Reeves, can you elucidate for us some of the policy that was being articulated right there at the very beginning?
Well, as has been mentioned, it was a foreign policy speech, and so it was a Cold War speech. That was the foreign policy of the day, and then Kennedy, in the address, expands it to include things like poverty and suffering in the world that have nothing to do with the Cold War, and also lays hints of what will come later about not only a new generation forged in war taking over, but because that new generation had been so united, it had the power and the right to try to expand new ideas in the way the world saw the way the world saw America, and the way the world saw itself, and how we saw the world, including our principal adversary, the Soviet Union.
And if it was largely a foreign policy speech, still there were intimations in important sentences in the speech that spoke to domestic audiences, and with Harris Wofford among us and Roger Wilkins, it's appropriate to look into some of those Ellen, were there parts of that speech that spoke especially to some of the disenfranchised groups that Dick mentioned?
Yes, I think that the insertion of those two crucial words, at home, in talking about this effort really to spread freedom and to realize the promise of a great democratic society were highly significant. President Kennedy saw America as an exceptional nation. It had had an exceptional history. But he often said, and he gave a foreshadowing of that in his inaugural, that America couldn't make an exception for itself in holding a very high standard in achieving the ideals of a democratic society. And that is, I think, one of the most powerful elements of his rhetoric, not only in the inaugural address, but in speeches throughout his presidency. And I must say, a very striking contrast to the politics of our own time. That is, he was someone who could manage to be critical of America, but in a way that was meant to galvanize citizens, to bring them together, and to bring their commitment and ambition to making this a better and more just society without inviting the kind of criticism that he was somehow unpatriotic or divisive.
We know how important a great speech can be, not only because we're all here, but because Hollywood may anoint a film about a speech and the difficulty of giving a speech this year for Best Oscar. But also, an inaugural can be like a coronation. There are festivities and rituals, and it's exciting. And I don't know if there ever has been a change of power as exciting as the one the world saw in January 1961. And if I could ask Sally Bedell Smith to elaborate a little bit on the excitement of those early hours and days in Washington.
Well, the mere fact that the administration was populated by people largely in their 30s and 40s, one of the things I did when I started writing my book was I put a list of all the key people in the front, and I was astonished to see that the oldest people were in their 50s. I think the oldest one may have been Adlai Stevenson, the ambassador to the UN, was 60, I think. So they were young, they were beautiful, it was such a contrast to the Trumans and the Eisenhowers, who were older and sort of blander. But both Jack and Jackie had a sense of an atmosphere that they wanted to create. Jackie, in particular, had a real vision, and I think the inauguration was the starting point. The choice of Robert Frost to read the poem, the fact that they included among the VIPs 50 of the greatest sort of literary lights and scholars in America. They were celebrated. It was the beginning of setting the tone of putting the arts and culture, that sort of the sophistication of Europe melded with the vitality and the power of the United States, and this was the beginning of this vision. And Jackie had lots of other ways that she carried that out. But the inaugural, even the fact that he wore, even though he didn't wear it at the time, but that he was wearing a top hat, and in that way it was slightly Anglo in its character, and the Kennedys had very strong ties, which proved to be politically advantageous as well as just being part of this cultural uplift with France, with England, but we can talk more about that later.
Dick, your book came out in 1993, I believe, the first year of the Clinton administration, which I served in, and it was really an important book for all of us to understand what a presidency is like on a daily basis. It's organized around days of the Kennedy administration, and yet you began with a rather shocking observation that President Kennedy was not prepared for the presidency, and then you follow it up by saying no one ever has been sufficiently prepared for the presidency, that it's entirely a reactive job, and then you go through all the crises that he had to begin to react towards. Has any president outside of Abraham Lincoln or Franklin D. Roosevelt ever had as serious a succession of crises as he faced in 1961?
I don't think so. I think there was I don't know what Martin Van Buren did. Ted has written a book on Martin Van Buren.
You got me.
But the density of event in the Kennedy administration was quite extraordinary. This may not be, when it did come out as Clinton was taking the presidency, and Clinton invited me to the White House to talk to him. We talked for about 4 hours about the Kennedy presidency, and what Bill Clinton's first question to me as we sat down at lunch outdoors was, how did he get away with all that stuff? So that Clinton too had an idea. But the presidency itself, and it shows better in the Kennedy presidency, I think, than anyone, partly because it was so well documented, partly because there were so many extraordinarily impressive people in that administration, was that the presidency is not what it seems. It is, as I said, no one can possibly be prepared, because the presidency is essentially a reactive job. You win it by saying all the things you're going to do. You get there, and suddenly there are oil spills in the Gulf. The entire Arab world is aflame, and you never quite get back to what you thought it would be like. And we judge our presidents on 1, 2, or 3 big things. Bill Clinton's great regret was nothing happened to him the way it happened to Kennedy, and even to the Bushes. And we judge our presidents by how they react to these events unforeseen. No one remembers whether Lincoln balanced the budget. And one of the reasons that we're really here, which I want to add to what Sally said, the Kennedy, and the reason many people are in this room, is a cultural figure, not a political figure anymore. He changed the way Americans thought. He changed the way we dressed. He changed the length of our hair, and then dealt with a series of crises that came along. But we weren't a rich nation before World War II, and we had to learn as we took the position of power in the world, as we became a superpower, which Ted has written brilliantly about. We didn't know how to act. And our role models were the Kennedys, Jack and Jackie, and that's why we are. And the one thing that's worth thinking, too, about him as president, John Kennedy was the first self-selected president. He could not have gotten the nomination by the normal route of what we call party bosses and backroom deals and whatnot. He went out in 2-3 years speaking all over the country, and unbeknownst to his principal rivals, Johnson, Stevenson, he had already had the nomination won for all practical purposes when they got to the convention in Los Angeles. He would not wait his turn. He was young. And now our young people will not wait their turn either. And it's those kind of messages that come through culture and social life rather than policy decisions. And if I just add one short sentence to that, since Ted is an expert on these things, the presidents we remember and know, Lincoln, Roosevelt, Kennedy, and probably Obama too, are men who understood that words are often more important than deeds, much more important. We can't remember the deeds. You can only lead a country of 300 million cantankerous people with words. You can't do it with programs. The words have to come first, and Kennedy, like Roosevelt, was brilliant at that.
Well, since you mentioned words, I'd like to turn again to Thurston Clarke and ask, how was it that the Kennedy team achieved such a high level so consistently throughout the presidency? It's not just one great speech at the beginning, but quite a few. In an anthology I edited, I put 5 Kennedy speeches, and the only president I included more from was Abraham Lincoln. And really, each one is independently excellent. How did they maintain that standard?
I think it's this wonderful kind of intellectual incestuousness between Kennedy and Sorensen. that you sometimes don't even know where one starts and one ends. There are lots of cases when I was looking over the campaign speeches in 1960, you'd see Kennedy saying something extemporaneously. Sorensen would give him some speech and he'd kind of use a few lines and then he'd go off on his own. Well, guess what happened? 2 weeks later, he'd have a prepared speech from Sorensen and it'd be full of Kennedy's extemporaneous remarks. So if you actually looked at it, you'd think, aha, Sorensen's written this speech, but actually Kennedy had written it earlier. I agree there's so many good speeches. One we forget is the one that he gave at the University of Washington in 1961, where he talks about the limits of American power, and he says something to the effect of, we have to realize that we're not omnipotent. We're only 6% of the world's population. We can't dictate to other people what they're going to do. My goodness, you could give that speech now. The other thing about the about the speeches that whenever I read them, there is the line I talked about Robert Frost earlier. He did write an original poem that he was supposed to deliver, but the sun was so bright that he couldn't read it. Luckily for Kennedy, because I think a line in that poem would have been in the headlines the next day. And the poem ended with a golden age of poetry and power, of which this noonday is the beginning hour. And 2 days later, Frost went to the White House to see Kennedy, and they had a chat, and Frost finally gave him the poem that he didn't deliver. And as he left, Frost said to him, now, I want you to be more Irish than Harvard. And then he said, and remember, poetry and power. Kennedy wrote him a note 2 days later, a typed note, and below it he wrote in his handwriting, it's poetry and power all the way. Now, what happened when you look at the Kennedy administration, actually there was a lot of poetry in his speeches in the first couple of years. The Moon speech, the one I mentioned, the University of Washington, when he talked during the Cuban Missile Crisis. But it wasn't until 1963 that he actually two speeches that he gave on two successive days, June 10th, June 11th. The first was the American University Peace in Our Time speech, and the second was the Civil Rights speech. And it wasn't until those two speeches, I think, that he finally put poetry together with the power of the presidency and did what Frost was urging him to do.
Can I talk about a moment about those two speeches? A thing that there was a dinner, Carolyn set up a dinner in New York, and Michael Beschloss and I were recruited to do the toast. My toast was about something we've just talked about, 50 hours in the life of a president. What is it like to be president of the United States? I have to cheat a little so I get the times right. But the days are June 9th to 11th, 1963. At 9:15 in the morning in San Francisco, Kennedy, coming back from the U.S. Conference of Mayors meeting in Hawaii, stopped at San Francisco and picked up Ted Sorensen, who had with him a copy of the speech which had not been announced nor talked about, called the Peace Speech. They worked on the editing of that speech as they flew back to Washington. They arrived in Washington at 9:15 a.m. on the 10th. Kennedy was in great pain with his back, and he went into a tub for 20 minutes, got dressed, went to American University at 10:15 and gave the peace speech, the speech that said perhaps, which had been foreshadowed in the inaugural, perhaps the time has come that we should change our entire attitude toward the Soviet Union and toward the Cold War. He then, one of the greatest speeches in American history, he then returned to the White House to learn to turn on the television and see that George Wallace, the governor of Alabama, was standing in the doorway of the University of Alabama. He had named himself provost to the university and was there to prevent the entrance of the first two black students to go to that school. And there was, he wasn't sure what to do because, as they quite articulately taught in the first session here, he was not that deep in terms of his domestic experience as he was in foreign. But he said, I think I may have to do something about this. And he was terribly disappointed watching that to find out there had been no reaction at all in the Soviet Union to his speech offering to change our relationship. At midnight, he was informed that Izvestia, for the first time, had printed word for word an entire speech by an American president. The next morning, he awoke to be handed a picture on the front page of the New York Times of the first monk burning himself to death in Vietnam. At noontime, with the students secreted into the University of Alabama, he decided against his advisors to stay out of it, made a couple of statements, and then prepared, which was given on 8 p.m. on June 12, 1963, one of the other great speeches in American history. And a lot of this speech, the civil rights speech that he gave that night, was ad-libbed because he was not prepared to make a speech. Particularly his brother didn't want him to make a speech, and it was in that speech that he did one of the things he will always be remembered for, if not consciously. And that was when he said, civil rights is not a regional issue or a political issue at all, or a national issue. It is a moral issue. This is about what kind of people we are. Up to that time, white Southerners, particularly those in power, thought Kennedy was a Northern politician secretly on their side. But the black kids that Harris talked about were listening to those same speeches, including the inaugural, and they were drawing their own message for it. They were, as I believe it was Harris who said to him, he said, where are these people getting these ideas? He said, from you, Mr. President. It's not only Eastern Europe that hears what you said. When he gave that speech, the speech saying this is a moral issue, the head of the NAACP in the state of Mississippi, the field agent, was driving in a car and stopped at a gas station, called his wife in Jackson, and said, I want you to keep the children up because I want to talk to them about what the president said tonight. And so he turned around, drove back to his house, stepped out in the driveway. His wife and 2 kids ran out the door, and he was shot to death from behind and bled to death in front of his wife and children. That was Medgar Evers. And that's what it was like to be John Kennedy.
One of the ways we historians measure presidential greatness is by the accident of the size of the problems they are called upon to solve, and that really is beyond the control of most presidents, as you said, Dick. But another way is the courage they display, thinking in new ways, and certainly in those 2 speeches you both mentioned, he not only said something very eloquently, but he evolved very significantly from earlier statements on the same subject. Lincoln said we must dare to think anew, and he was doing that in both the AU speech, which was very conciliatory to the Soviet Union, and the Civil Rights Address. And through television, he was reaching hundreds of millions of people. And Ellen, did you get a sense in your book about the letters written to Mrs. Kennedy that they felt a personal connection through those speeches and through that medium of the TV?
There's no question about that, the American people forged an intensely personal relationship with this president and this first family. And I think part of that was that John F. Kennedy shared with hundreds of thousands, millions of American families a defining experience, and that was his service in the Second World War. Whether the family had a son, a daughter, a father, a brother who served in the war or was impacted by the war, who had suffered losses through the war, who had gotten a job in a defense factory. World War II was a transforming experience for this country, and John F. Kennedy served. He was a war hero, and that connected him. The striking thing about many of these letters was that In retrospect, much is made of the way in which President Kennedy was this singular figure, very handsome, very wealthy, moving in this kind of social stratosphere. But what was so profoundly apparent in these letters was that many, many Americans who lived in utter poverty, who literally, there were letters from people who said that they were so cold in the winter because they couldn't heat their own homes. People who had lived their entire lives with the scourge of segregation, denying them fundamental opportunities. They identified with John F. Kennedy. They thought he was on their side, that he was really sincerely concerned about their prospects and that he wanted to give them a better life. The capacity to reach people in this great and very diverse country in the way that he did was itself, I think, an extraordinary achievement. Much is made about presidents being given wonderful opportunities. War, for example, how horrible an opportunity. John F. Kennedy made these opportunities. He was the first president to ever stand in front of this country and say that segregation is a moral wrong and that this country faced a moral crisis. That it wasn't about doing what was diplomatically convenient or savvy or economically wise. It was a matter of what is right. Those words were not, before that point, ever uttered from the seat of the presidency. Not since Reconstruction had a president stepped forward and offered this commitment to civil rights, however belatedly. And that's a tremendously significant moment. The hundreds of letters from African Americans, thousands, that are in this library attest to how profoundly moving that was.
Since we are in the history business, we have to deal with facts as we see them and be objective. And no one would look at the early months of the Kennedy presidency and say it was all Camelot and grace under pressure. There were serious setbacks in foreign policy, the Bay of Pigs, the difficult summit with Khrushchev in Vienna, the Berlin crisis, which barely averted a nuclear catastrophe. How did he recover from problems that might have crippled another president? Dick, maybe start with you.
Well, I think part of it was youth and being well-read. He did have, and we have seen in recent years presidents that did not have a sense of history, and also a sense of how things had been resolved in the past, and also a sense of destiny, I think, in terms of civil rights. That is, that when he gave the speech that Ellen and I and Thurston were talking about, he was, in a democracy, putting the power of the state behind a minority. And that was no small thing. That changed American history. I think it changed world history. And that line was ad-libbed in the line about it being a moral dilemma.
Thurston,
I just want to jump in quickly. After the assassination, Bobby Kennedy tried to comfort Jackie. And one of the things he said was, well, at least you can take comfort from the fact that he wasn't shot in 1961 when he would have been seen as one of the worst presidents. And Henry Braden, who was heard this, was kind of appalled that this was rather a heartless thing to say. But someone who knew JFK as well as those two knew that it was somewhat encouraging. You know, after the Bay of, he didn't really recover very quickly after the Bay of Pigs. There's this one period of a few weeks later, he's going out of the White House, and this crowds are cheering him. And he says he's with Paul Fay, his friend, and he says, if they think they're going to get me to run again, they're crazy. And then a few weeks later, he's talking, I think, to Lem Billings or maybe to Fay, and he said, I'm not going to run. He said, you know, I'm deciding how much help I'm going to give Lyndon Johnson. Probably more than Ike gave Nixon, but I'm not so sure about that. 6 months later, John Scali of ABC wants to write a book about about his administration, and he comes to talk to him. And Kennedy says, why would anybody want to write a book about what promises to be a very tragic administration? But I think you know some.
But on the other hand, one reason why he rebounded from the Bay of Pigs is because he took full responsibility for it. And as a consequence, his popularity actually went up afterwards. But I wanted to mention something else in connection with a point you made earlier, which is the power of image for the Kennedy administration, and not in any kind of a meretricious sense. I mean, they really understood the need to communicate what they were doing through television, through pictures. And Jackie in particular had a very strategic sense about theatricality and what it could do to shape how people looked at what they were doing. And you know, she thought of it was both in the large sense and even smaller ways. When she was restoring the White House, she asked that they put a very large square mirror in the grand foyer of the White House, so that when they had state dinners, when they had state occasions, when foreign leaders came, and they had the procession and the Marine band and everybody coming in, everybody could see it. She once talked to one of the photographers who was taking pictures of them, and she said, don't take close-up pictures of us. Take pictures of the people looking at us. So she had a very sophisticated sense of how to project their image in the best sort of way.
I think that one of the things that's sometimes ignored about Kennedy and his father was that his father came out of the movie business. And if we now look back at how Kennedy promoted himself with the images that you talked about, Kennedy was the first, and now they all do, to promote himself exactly the way they promote a movie. It was, in that sense, a campaign from Hollywood, and since Hollywood is as good as doing that as anybody in the world, it served them very well. He would often, John Kennedy, the most impatient of men, a man who lived his life as a race against boredom, would still study photographs of himself for hours before he would allow them released in public, because he thought that was an extraordinarily important part of his job, and he was right.
Yeah, and it was no mistake that it was Joe Kennedy's idea, and Jackie embraced it when she chose her designer, Oleg Cassini, for a lot of reasons, one of which was that he had designed for the movies. And he understood how to make her a theatrical presence.
One of the many things that Joe Kennedy said during the 50s, according to Jack, was several times he said, can't you get it through your head that it doesn't matter who you are, it's what matters is what people think you are, the person who they think you are. And he said this to him several times.
If theatrical, he also had a remarkable gift for spontaneity and humor in press conferences, in formal speeches, the ad-libs, as you mentioned. And I read all your books for this event, and in one of them, I believe Dick's, someone came in early in the JFK administration and offered him a plan for the Kennedy Library, and he said, if I have another year like this one, there won't be any Kennedy Library. So we're lucky.
In which he said to Sorensen after the Bay of Pigs, well, at least I've got a title for, you've got a title for your book. He knew Sorensen would be writing a book saying, the title will be Kennedy, the Only Years.
So this rehabilitation began after those crises, which, as Sally pointed out, actually heightened his popularity. And throughout that time, he was traveling not only to Europe, but in Latin America. Jackie Kennedy was a surprisingly useful adjunct to his foreign policy, speaking in French in Paris and in Spanish in South America. Can you talk about what she did for him?
Oh, she did an extraordinary amount. I mean, I think people so tended to underestimate her because she was beautiful and she was stylish, and people kind of stereotyped her on that basis, that she was simply a style icon. But in fact, she had, you know, a very well-constructed view of what she wanted to do and the kinds of people she wanted to bring to the White House. And when she went to Paris and sat next to de Gaulle, she conversed with him in very fluent French, and not only could she speak the French, but she understood French culture and literature, and you know, she was very, very well versed in 18th century literature. She had a little bust on her desk upstairs in her little private office of Madame de Pompadour as a sphinx, which she felt was a kind of metaphor for the way she wanted to be, because she liked to preserve her own mystery. But she thoroughly charmed de Gaulle. You know, he came here and he said, the only one thing I want to do is take Jacqueline Kennedy home with me. And so that, you know, and when she and her sister went to India, Ken Galbraith wrote or sent a cable or something saying that she had done more to improve relations with India than anybody. She just she understood how to talk to leaders. I mean, at times she could be flirtatious, but mostly she was knowledgeable. I mean, when she went to Paris, she forged a close friendship with Andre Malraux, who was the director. Intellectual crush.
But said her husband.
Said her husband. But it was a very important point. You know, he took her to Malmaison, which was Napoleon and Josephine's home, and she understood the history of that home. She knew who the atelier was who had designed all his furniture. He in turn had designed James Monroe's furniture. She helped to bring that knowledge into the restoration of the White House. Of course, the connections with Harold Macmillan and his relative, David Ormsby Gore, they were all, as somebody said, they were all out of the same hat, because Jack Kennedy's sister had been married to the heir to the Duke of Devonshire. And so they had these kind of extraordinary connections, and she had the capacity to exploit them in the best sense of the word. To, you know, obviously she wasn't a policy maker, she wasn't anything like that, but she could also, she was very good eyes and ears. You know, she could she could see who was for him and who was against him, and she.
You're the President of the United States. You've just ordered one of the stupidest and mistake-ridden invasions in world history, with the sons of rich people in Cuba trying to take the island back from Castro, and Kennedy literally thought he might be finished by that. He had been so inept, so ill-informed, so lied to by his own people. And he was terrified of, but had the guts to go meet the survivors of the brigade and their families and their parents in the Orange Bowl in Miami. And he was half afraid they were going to go after him. I mean, he had destroyed many of their families, and his wife gets up and speaks to them in Spanish, and they go crazy.
It was a moment, yeah.
And his aides were afraid that he's going to say something, which he did. And he said, "This flag will be returned to you in a free Havana." Right. And at that point, Ken O'Donnell and everybody are going crazy, because he's just pledged to do another pair of pigs.
Believe that he got out of there alive, and it was his wife who did it.
Exactly, yeah.
So you've all spoken about his great power as a shifter of the culture. And Ellen, you've spoken about how he reached out to people in the margins of society. And other kinds of changes were happening in the 60s that didn't really stem from the leadership any president could provide. The women's movement was taking shape, and environmental stewardship and urban renewal. And a lot of people were claiming rights for themselves. To what extent can we link that to the rhetoric or the deeds of the Kennedy White House?
I would think about 80%.
Ellen?
His first slogan, political slogan, when he ran for Congress here, was "The new generation offers a leader." Well, indeed, and he became that leader, and also benefited or unleashed all of the creativity of the country that had been crushed by the war and the immediate aftermath, and there was this then cultural, technological flowering of vital people who had been held back. I'm sorry.
That's okay. I agree. I think, though, in some ways this was a perfect storm. There was a country that had come out of World War II, strong, prosperous, really a colossus, standing over a ruined world, as historians often will describe America in that period. And then a period during the Eisenhower administration when, people talk about it as a time of quiescence. It really wasn't. The civil rights movement, the Brown decision, all of this really beginning to change the face of this country in very powerful ways. The employment of women during the Second World War, they never really were demobilized. They were demobilized from defense industries, but women's labor force participation is rising in this period, and that's going to have a very profound impact. One thing that isn't talked enough about President Kennedy is that he appointed the first Presidential Commission on the Status of Women, which was a very prescient thing. He recognized that the change was afoot and that women's roles were going to be changing. The initial report that was issued by this commission, still read today, still calling, and we're still trying to achieve some of what it called for in terms of equity in employment. So you have a whole sort of series of changes that are occurring, and then you have a young, vigorous president putting a positive accent, the valence on change, and arguing that this is crucial to bringing the country into the latter part of the 20th century. Now, that change often outstripped or was faster than his wishes when he was in the position of having to respond to those demands. And one of the things that's happened, I think, from a historical standpoint in looking at President Kennedy is that historians have told much more about the story that Roger referred to earlier about civil rights as being a revolution that came from the ground up. That is, the role of everyday common folk in bringing about this revolution in American society, overturning segregation. And formal institutions of government weren't always as brisk in responding favorably to that. But the crucial thing, I think, about President Kennedy is that he rose to his historical moment. So he unleashed it, in a sense, but when he found himself on the other end of it and was sometimes more halting than people wished him to be, at the critical moment, he stood up and really did do something very important and powerful and lasting.
I got a call a few weeks ago from a reporter from USA Today trying to assess his legacy on its 50th anniversary of his presidency beginning. And I said, well, probably the fact that you and I are alive to have this conversation. And we lose a sense 50 years later as historians writing for new generations of what the Cold War meant and the looming fear of Armageddon, which was probably never looming more seriously than in those 3 years. How do we keep that fear alive in the history books? And how do we write for generations that fortunately will not have that fear to reckon with? Maybe I could just ask you in a row. Thurston?
Well, thank goodness for Mad Men, because they had a whole episode when they had the Cuban Missile Crisis, and the characters all, it's very good. They all talk about how they thought it was the end and where they're all preparing to die. No, that's the way it was. I remember I was 16 years old, and we expected to look over to where Boston was and to see the mushroom cloud coming up. It was a terrifying period. And I think that Kennedy's handling of it sets the stage for the accomplishments of his presidency. It's because of the Cuban Missile Crisis that he and Khrushchev start to enter into this extraordinary secret personal correspondence that finally results in the Test-Ban Treaty and would have resulted, I think, in a number of other examples, other bills, other treaties. In fact, Kennedy was planning to visit in 1964, just before going to Dallas. He was making arrangements to go to, he had told people that he was going to go to Moscow and see Khrushchev. So I think that when you look at Kennedy's presidency, from the Cuban Missile Crisis to Dallas, the whole table is set by what Kennedy does. And also that depends on people's, it influenced the reaction of the American people to him, too. I think he suddenly became, he was our savior. He saved our lives. And that's the way people looked at it at the time.
Is that his greatest achievement, Sally?
Well, yeah, and I think so. And but I mean, I think it's very difficult for those of us who actually lived through it. And I mean, it was. I mean, we have the war on terror today, and this murky, ubiquitous threat that's hard to put your finger on. Back then, it was one power, and it was a completely existential threat. And I think it was difficult to know at the time because nobody knew the details of what was going on during the 13 days and how he balanced arguments and how he was able to communicate secretly to Khrushchev about the missiles in Turkey and how that's really what kind of brought it to a close. But but the fact that he was able to carry the country through something so dire, and it really was at the moment. People thought the world was going to blow up, and he was, and I agree with Thurston. He was able to build on that.
Sally, what we talk about poetry and power, he gives the speech on the night of the Cuban Missile Crisis, and he talks about what is a victory in a nuclear war. Victory would be ashes in our mouths. I mean, that's, there's the poetry, yeah. And then there's the power. He is not going to take the advice of all of his advisors and make a preemptive strike on Cuba. He's going to set up the blockade. And if that hadn't worked, we now know he planned to go to the United Nations.
And his decision-making was interesting because it was not just confined to the people around him. He was reaching out and he was talking with Macmillan every night. I'm not sure if Macmillan really helped him a lot, but he was a kind of a sounding board. And David Ormsby Gore, who was the British ambassador to the United States, who was extremely close to Kennedy, was considered almost like another member of his cabinet, was down on the floor with him on the second floor of the White House picking out which pictures to send out to the media from the surveillance photographs, and also very, I think, astutely advised him to change the size of the cordon around the blockade. And so, he was flexible. He was open. It was a sort of a model of his decision making.
He was, as Mr. Donahue said, a politician. And though the Vienna summit early in the Kennedy administration is considered to be a great failure, it wasn't a great failure on at least one point, and that was that he recognized that Nikita Khrushchev was just another politician. He just happened to work in a different system. And throughout those 13 days, it was Kennedy rejecting the use of force and trying to find a way out. Twice he did this with Khrushchev, again on the Berlin Wall, find a way out for the Soviet politician to back off. And the way these folks think is, Kennedy said in private after the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Cuban Missile Crisis was triggered because we had long-range missiles and Polaris missiles, and all the Soviets had at that time were medium-range missiles. They were not strategic missiles which could kind of bound the earth. Khrushchev gambled that he could put medium-range missiles into Cuba, and they would have the same effect as the American strategic missiles, hundreds of them, aimed at the Soviet Union. And so that Kennedy kept holding off their advice until he found a way for one politician to talk to another in those letters. And if anybody is fuzzy on what the recommendations were, General Curtis LeMay handed him a plan to eliminate Cuba, to literally blow Cuba off the map, and that would be that. After that meeting, Kennedy said to someone, I've forgotten who, probably McNamara, don't ever let that man near me again. 6 months later, he appointed Curtis LeMay as the Chief of Staff of the Air Force. This is the way politicians work. And when someone said, how could you do that when you think he's crazy like this? He said, yeah, I think he's crazy, I think he's a bum. But that's what people thought about Babe Ruth, and they loved him.
But also, I mean, getting back to Vienna, it was a calamity for him. He went to London afterwards and had a long meeting with Macmillan, and Macmillan reported in a letter to the Queen that that he was absolutely shattered. He said he was sort of he was like a bull being assaulted by a picador. And he said that it was the first person he'd ever run into who was completely impervious to his charms, and it was.
I don't think that anyone who's sentient today needs the Kennedy Library or the Kennedy administration to remind them of the possibility of Armageddon. In point of fact, the arms race escalated during the Kennedy years, and we have more nuclear weapons in the hands of more rogue states and countries than we did in 1963. But I think what we can learn from looking at Kennedy's response to these realities is that there are two things I think that are important to emphasize. One, that he had experienced warfare himself. He had a strong sense of the horrors of warfare. And that although the inaugural address in some ways is very bellicose, it's very much a Cold War speech in some respects, he also, when push came to shove, responded very moderately in the use of military power at each critical moment. And towards the end of his presidency was very, very committed to pulling back, it seems to me, from the Cold War tensions, which he had always hoped to minimize, but really began to have success in doing so towards the end of his presidency. The American University speech is, of course, the best example of that. But it should also be said that one of the things that made John Kennedy who he was as president was his commitment to using the power of the federal government to address and eradicate inequality in this country, to support the lives of working people, to try to bring about greater social and economic justice. And in that sense, the politics, the liberalism that he did stand foursquarely behind, he strongly believed in using the power of the presidency, the power of the federal government in these ways. And so I think, we shouldn't wash out who he was in the interests of making him a president of our own time. If you look at his speeches on health care in the early 1960s, it's shocking. One, because so many of the problems he raised are still with us today, but also it's hard to imagine a president taking that stand in America given contemporary politics today.
That's a good point. We have a number of excellent questions from the audience. I don't think we can get through all of them, but how do you think we will assess John F. Kennedy 50 years from now on the centenary? Maybe, Ellen, why don't I start with you and we can work. Yeah. Ellen? Dick, you want to start? Okay.
I mean, I think he will stand up well. I mean, obviously, the brevity of the administration sort of counts against him, I suppose, because he didn't even have a full term. But I think for all the things we've been talking about today, the fact that he he prevented nuclear annihilation, that he did carry forward some both domestic and foreign policies that were extremely consequential down through the decades, that we're feeling we have a black American president, African American president today, and I think you could find the first the first seedlings of that in the actions that were taken and then followed through by Johnson.
It could be said that any president, no matter the events of his presidency, should be judged by whether he brings out the best or the worst in the American people. And there's a lot of worst in the American people, as we know, and John Kennedy, as opposed to some recent presidents, did bring out the best in the American people. And they were better off in their own psyches, in their own minds, at the end of his presidency than at the beginning. And his one achievement, which is quite extraordinary, I think, John Kennedy came to power the day he came into office. He was the first president since 1812 where he had to face the danger of foreign invasion. Missiles and jets had shortened the distances. We'd been protected by oceans for all that time. And I would argue, at least, that there was less chance of confrontation at the end of the Kennedy administration than at the beginning of the administration. And that's no small thing. To give one example, if there were to be a war in those times, it would have begun in Berlin. Berlin was really where American and Soviet interests collided, and where at one point the Soviets thought they could drive us out. I'm hoping that somewhere in this building someone will find a paper showing what I'm certainly convinced, that John Kennedy knew the Berlin Wall was going up before it did. I mean, I know he did because I know what he read in times, and it was in the popular press that they were thinking of a wall. And his position, which has been greatly distorted, has the wall was on East German territory. So it wasn't a question of knocking down the wall. You had to attack East Germany, and by consequences, the Soviet Union. But Khrushchev had this incredible political problem that Eastern Europe was depopulated. The talented people, the teachers, the doctors, the lawyers, were fleeing to the west through Berlin, 2,000 a day. Khrushchev had to stop that. He had to stop it to preserve the country he ruled. Kennedy's problem was we didn't have, they could have driven us out of Europe in a matter of weeks. We had no way to defend Europe and our own claims in Europe, our own these were occupied countries after all still, without using nuclear weapons. And obviously Kennedy did not want to use nuclear weapons. And basically, someday a paper will come out showing the collusion between the two of them to solve each other's problems. And on that claim, Kennedy, on the claim of what happened in Berlin and Cuba too, and what happened in civil rights, probably will still be judged either a very, very good, I think probably very good, or even great president 50 years from now. And I'm hoping we'll all be back to talk about it.
Thurston and then Ellen.
Just very quickly, I think it's the normal. I think it's going to be the moon shot. It's going to be the missile crisis. It's going to be the inaugural address, which was judged as one of the two great speeches of the 20th century, and I think it will still be up there. And I think it's this inspirational thing. During 1963, in the summer of '63, Norman Cousins said, "There's nothing so powerful as a man acting on his own conscience." And that's what Cousins was one of the intermediaries for the test ban treaty, and he was referring to Kennedy. And I think that there was something powerful, and it remains something that remains powerful about a man acting on his own conscience. And I think that's going to be the part of the whole inspirational thing that's going to be Kennedy's going to be remembered for.
Ellen?
Well, I've written a long and laborious scholarly book on the writing of American history, which my mother read and I wrote, and a few other people read it. No one here, of course. But what that study taught me is that historians themselves are very much a product of their own time, and it's sobering to see how true that is. And historians of our own time have sought to write some of the hagiography that grew up around President Kennedy after his tragic death, and to sort of move the pendulum back to the middle. And I think probably did perhaps too good a job at that, so that we've lost a sense of the bigger picture. But the real, I think, fact of the matter is that President Kennedy and his administration will, I believe, remain evergreen. The memory of it will be evergreen, in part because he captured the imagination and idealism of this country. There's a wonderful passage in The Great Gatsby at the end where Fitzgerald describes how Dutch sailors might have felt when they saw Long Island for the first time, this great green breast of the New World. And he describes it as a moment when people had the opportunity to see something that was commensurate with the human capacity for wonder. And in some ways, I feel as if President Kennedy also tapped in to that sense of possibility, of wonder, in such a powerful way that we will revisit again and again what he attempted to do, what he did do, where he fell short, and it will be a message for subsequent generations.
Beautifully put. I want to thank Thurston and Sally and Dick and Ellen for a memorable panel, and say that even if we are historians, we too like to live in the present. And the discovery of this new fragment of the inaugural speech today, and the acts, the brave acts we are seeing on a daily basis in the Middle East and in Algeria, where President Kennedy's speech still has a lot to say, shows that these speeches will be with us for a long time to come. Thank you.